Good morning from the East Coast of the US. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. It's great to have you here. Welcome to this discussion panel on Global Biodiversity Day, the Science Summit of the UN General Assembly 77, SUNGA 77. My name is John Paul Rodriguez. I chair the Iucn Species Survival Commission, we usually refer to as SSC. I'll be the moderator of this extraordinary panel to discuss the status of standards and tools that inform actions and policies to reverse biodiversity loss. They will also explain where we are in the context of these instruments and what challenges we're still facing in terms of reversing biodiversity loss. There are guests in this session from around the world online. So please, while I introduce the panel, just tell us where you're from by typing your city or your country on the chat. We have four fabulous panelists. From Colombia, Ángela Andrade, chair of the Iucn Commission on Ecosystem Management. She has dedicated herself to promoting at a global level nature-based solutions in response to biodiversity and climate change crises, to both crises. From Switzerland, Sonia Peña Moreno, she's the director of the Iucn International Policy Center. She leads Iucn's global policy work and heads delegations to conventions, for example, mainly in the context of the Rio conventions. I got ahead of myself. From Argentina, Gabriel Lichtenstein, she's SSC Regional Vice Chair for South and Mesoamerica and researcher at the Argentinian National Research Council, CONICET. Her research focuses on sustainable use of South American camelids. She's also a chapter lead author in the assessment report on sustainable use of wild species, very recently released by IPBES. And from the United States, we have Robin Jasden. She's a research professor with the Forest Research Institute at the University of the Sunshine Coast in Queensland. Her research focuses on natural regeneration of forests and landscape restoration and ecosystem services provided by forests. Since we have a wide, diverse audience attending this session and those that will hear us later on the recording, by the way, the session is being recorded and it will be available for others to see later on. Let's begin by each one of you, the four panelists, giving us a brief introduction to the topics that you have specialized in and what you perceive as your primary contributions in this field. I'm going to give the floor to Ángela first, I think, and Naomi will help us sharing the screen with the presentation. Naomi, over to you. Okay, Ángela, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Sorry, Naomi, this is the last one. Thank you. Thank you very much, John Paul, and thank you all for joining this session. So first, I would like to highlight some of the most known approaches to address sustainability that we have these days. We have the ecosystem approach adopted by the CBD in the year 2000 as the main framework for the implementation of the mandate of the CBD. Later on, we had some applications, specific applications based on the ecosystem approach, better known as ecosystem-based approaches. And we have examples like ecosystem-based approaches to climate change mitigation and adaptation. And later on, we have the definition of nature-based solutions that was adopted by Iucn in the year 2016, and we have been working since then with the Commission on Ecosystem Management on promoting the application and the development of the standard together with the Iucn, the global community. The next one, please. So one of the most important things to consider these days is that all the major problems that we have are connected. And so that means that all the responses that we have to establish and to address these problems is that they have to be interconnected as well and integrated. And this is a big challenge so far because traditionally we have been used to address the problems in isolation, and that has created a lot of trade-offs that we are suffering these days. So at this point, one of the main challenges is to address all these main problems in an integrated manner. And as you know from the IPCC, the latest report, our society is addressing high risks under different climate change scenarios, and that's highly affecting biodiversity and human well-being, especially regarding the main ecosystem services provided. So that is a warning that we need to increase the urgency, and any action that we do has to start immediately. The next one, please. So recently we have some reports, one from the Stockholm Resilience Center that is highlighting that the primary productivity proxies are estimating that at least 29% of the global terrestrial ecosystems and 24% of marine ones show symptoms of resilience loss. So this is really a big issue, because that means that we are not losing the ecosystems, but we are also losing the opportunity to restore the ecosystems and to recreate the environment and the nature that we used to have. And this is increasing with any degree or any small change in global warming is affecting precipitation, is affecting sea level rise, and there are special reports on coral reefs, on sea level rise, on tree mortality in different ecosystem types. The next one, please. So to address all these problems, IUCN has not only established and adopted the definition of nature-based solutions, but in the year 2020, the Global Members Assembly of IUCN adopted the IUCN standard to make sure that there is a common understanding of nature-based solutions, since this concept is becoming quite important for the political level, but also the practical level of implementing actions to address these global issues, and to guarantee high quality interventions, to create a global user community, including different sectors, and help the implementation on the ground. And so the main criteria are looking to address multiple problems, as I mentioned, in an integrated manner, based on a clear identification of main societal challenges with communities and relevant stakeholders. It's also designed at scale, making sure that connections across spatial and temporal scales are considered, making sure that interventions provide net gains in biodiversity and include social and environmental safeguards, human rights, inclusiveness, gender-based inequity. Also is focused on identifying and balancing trade-offs, and incorporates adaptive management as a learning by doing strategy, and based on different types of knowledge, recognizing indigenous peoples and local communities' knowledge and full participation in all the process. And finally, mainstreaming nature-based solutions across sectors, across scales, and not only in practice, but also in policy development. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. Sorry, I was muted. I think Sonia comes next. Will Naomi also share? Yes, there you go. Thank you.
There you go. Thank you, Jean-Paul. It's a pleasure to join everyone today in this event. I have 3 slides. Next one, Naomi, please. So first, I'd like to point out the sense of urgency, and this follows nicely after Angela's introductory remarks. If one looks at the headlines and most recent reports of IPCC, IPBES, we can all agree that the state of our planet, our natural resources, of ecosystems, of biodiversity is in decline. And these downward trends are accelerating, and societies are experiencing more and more those impacts from climate change, from biodiversity loss, from pollution, etc. This affects us all. And with this urgency in mind, back in 2018, the parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity, the CBD, agreed that there was a need to come up with a new plan, a new global biodiversity framework for the post-2020 period. It was supposed to be adopted in 2020. It has been significantly delayed because of the pandemic. But now a process has been set in motion to agree and to negotiate such a framework. Next slide. But there is still a chance to catch up and speed up efforts to conclude those negotiations under the auspices of the CBD. And this will happen this year in December during the 15th meeting of the Conference of the Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity. This will take place in Montreal in December. So we have an opportunity here. We're calling for those parties negotiating such an agreement to continue those negotiations in a way that it's constructive, to agree on such an ambitious framework that will catalyze the necessary action that is needed to achieve the long-term vision of the 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature. We need that agreement to be specific on what should be achieved by 2030 and define clear communicable goals and action targets, or the actions that are needed to achieve those goals. Next slide, please. However, a nicely written document and the perfect language won't do the trick. So we must all together act to halt biodiversity loss and start that path towards restoration and recovery. So here we need, and you see it there, sort of an inspiration and a compelling mission that touches us all, that brings us all together in the same effort. We want to halt and reverse the loss of biodiversity and achieve that nature positive world by 2030. We want to convey that this is not business as usual, that there is a change that is needed, that is transformational or transformative. And then that should give us a sense of direction, of purpose. And again, I will repeat that this is for all society. It cannot be for governments alone. So those that are negotiating, yes, are governments, but there are many others like us at Iucn, like civil society, observers to the convention that are participating actively, proposing new ways and recommendations to go ahead with those negotiations. I leave it there because of time, and I thank you.
Thank you so much, Sonia. Next comes Gabriela, and also I think Naomi will share the screen. There we go.
Yeah, good morning, everybody from Argentina. And as Jean-Paul mentioned, my area of expertise is community-based management, in particular sustainable use of vicuñas and guanacos in Andean countries. And I was involved as a lead author in IPBES Sustainable Use Assessment, and this is what I wanted to share with you in my short presentation. So first of all, for those of you who might not know, what is IPBES? IPBES is the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. It was established by its member states in 2012, and it has already 139 member countries. The overall objective of IPBES is to strengthen the science policy interface for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. And IPBES so far has produced 9 assessments, a global assessment for regional assessments and 4 thematic assessments. And the sustainable use assessment is one of those thematic assessments. And together with the values assessment, there were both just agreed and launched last July. Next slide, please. So in the case of the sustainable use assessment, it was started in 2018. Unfortunately, most of it had to be written during the pandemic. It was approved, as I said, by the member states in just last July, and the whole team was comprised by 3 co-chairs, 78 authors from 37 countries and 200 contributing authors that went over 6,000 different literature pieces in order to write the report. Next one, please. So the aim of this assessment is to analyze the status and trends in the sustainable use of wild species and the drivers or causes of the change, to consider approaches that enhance the sustainable use of wild species, to identify challenges and opportunities, and to strengthen practices, measures, capacities, and tools. Next, please. The IPBES has already published the summary for policymakers. I will share the link with you promptly. With the report has many key findings, but if I have to concentrate on some of them, we could say that billions of people in developing and developed countries benefit daily from the use of wild species for food, energy, clothes, medicine, and recreation. And the accelerating global biodiversity crisis, which was mentioned recently by my colleagues, threatens these livelihoods. The report depicts the material and social cultural cost of biodiversity loss. So ensuring sustainability of the use of wild species is critical to reverse the global trend in the biodiversity decline. Sustainable use of wild species was also found to be central to the identity and existence of many indigenous people and local communities. Indigenous people manage fishing, gathering, terrestrial animal harvesting, and other uses of wild species on more than 38 million square kilometers of land and 87 countries. So this coincides with approximately 40% of terrestrial conserved areas, including mainly high biodiversity. So policies supporting secure tenure rights and equitable access to land, fisheries, and forests, as well as poverty alleviation, create enabling conditions for sustainable use of wild species. Next, please. So at the report, we have different case studies, and actually one of the case studies was the one on vicuña use, which, as I mentioned before, is the area where I work. And vicuña use by Andean countries was used to illustrate how fairness, rights, and equitable distribution of benefits are essential to ensure sustainable use, and that sustainable use is positively influenced by secure rights of access and use, participation in governance, securing and particularly securing women's participation in decision-making, accountability, and education, meaning intra and intergenerational education, and also embedding ILK in all of these processes. Next, please. So the report points out 7 elements that are effective for policy with regards to sustainable use, and this can be condensed as, and all of these are also illustrated in the case of the vicuña. And in the first case, we need inclusive and participatory decision-making. We need the inclusion of multiple forms of knowledge and recognition of rights, equitable distribution of costs and benefits along the commodity chains, policy tailored to local social and ecological contexts. We need monitoring and adaptive management. We need coordinated and aligned policies and robust institutions from customary to statutory. Thank you. That's it for now.
Thank you, Gabriela. And now for this last intervention of this initial round, Robin, please. I believe you'll share your own screen. There you go. Looks great.
Okay, hold on. I think I shared. Okay. There you go. Hello, everybody. I'm going to be focusing my comments on the very exciting UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, as this is really the consuming all of us who are working in restoration globally. And the goals of the UN Decade are very broad. They include preventing and halting degradation, as well as reversing degradation of ecosystems worldwide. And this really means that ecosystem restoration includes all ecosystems, and therefore it includes all sectors of society. So it's for everyone and every place. And here I have grouped ecosystems in 5 different categories just to illustrate how pervasive restoration needs to be globally and how inclusive the restoration needs to be. So we're talking about avoiding degradation and protecting and restoring wild or native ecosystems. Those are terrestrial, aquatic, coastal, and marine. We're talking about recovering properties of managed natural ecosystems and sustaining their productivity. These include all of these different types of managed natural ecosystems on land and on sea and on the coast. We also are talking about damaged ecosystems such as post-industrial sites or pit mines or landfills that have no resemblance at all to the ecosystem prior to their transformation. Also, we're talking about managed production systems that are used for production of agriculture or grazing areas or commercial plantations and agroforestry systems that we want to maintain sustainably producing and improve their management. And finally, we need to be considering the matrix of ecosystems as they exist within broader landscapes and watersheds and deltas and seascapes. All of these are the purview of ecosystem restoration. And because of that, we see that the types of restorative actions that need to be taken really vary widely across different types of ecosystems. So for example, where we have a wild or native ecosystem that we're restoring, we want to reduce human impacts, protect existing natural ecosystems, and reintroduce any species that may have been lost from that system locally. In the case of a managed natural ecosystem, we want to improve sustainable ecosystem management and make sure that that management is providing multiple social and environmental benefits. Where ecosystems have been damaged or totally converted, we want to remove or mitigate toxic waste, replace topsoil if needed, convert from gray to green infrastructure, reconstruct hydrology. These are very intensive interventions that would be needed. In the case of a managed production system, we want to take actions to sustain productivity, reduce climate vulnerability, and reduce negative impacts on the surrounding areas. And in the case of a matrix of ecosystems, restorative actions should be restoring connectivity among elements or remnant habitats, enhancing multiple functions within and across the ecosystems within the broader region. And what is often boggling to many of us is that there are so many different terms out there that are being used to describe these restorative actions. And it's important to realize that these are really all part of ecosystem restoration as it is being defined by the UN decade. And it's really a question of applying the right kind of restorative actions to the ecosystems in question or to the matrix of ecosystems in question. So many of you realize that we're talking basically in the case of wild or native ecosystems about conservation. That is part of ecosystem restoration, as well as ecological restoration, which sort of was the early development of restoration to assist the recovery of ecosystems. But also avoided natural regeneration is one of the important actions in this, and rewilding, as well as assisting natural regeneration and protecting it. In the case of managed ecosystems, we often use the term rehabilitation, and this can involve sustainable management of different types of ecosystems and fisheries, and also control of invasive species. For damaged ecosystems, the term reclamation and remediation are often used. Here, the goal is not to restore the original ecosystem, but to restore properties of the land so it can be used in other ways or so that it doesn't contain toxic elements. For managed production systems, this is where sustainable land management comes in, land restoration, climate smart agriculture, and also regenerative agriculture. Those are all restorative actions in this realm. And in the matrix of ecosystems, the terms integrated landscape management are often used. Landscape restoration and forest and landscape restoration all focus on taking actions that are improving and enhancing the overall region of landscape that includes multiple ecosystems. And the important point here is that these different restoration interventions should align closely with local and landscape context, with the actual potential for recovery in the ecosystem and the local needs. And as far as my own work and interests, they lie in these areas with assisted natural regeneration. I work very much on forest regrowth and regeneration and how we can assist that process through a variety of mechanisms. Also, I work with sustainable forest management and also focus on forest and landscape restoration. And really, to be effective and long-lasting, it's important to view ecosystem restoration in a proactive way, to be taking proactive measures rather than simply constructing a reactive response that's solving an immediate problem. And this is not to deny the urgency, as has been mentioned by others. Urgent action is needed, but it must be thoughtful and using a proactive approach. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robin. Excellent. So when I was preparing for the session, I was, thinking about what kinds of things would I be curious to learn from you. I'm sure there are other people in the audience feel the same way, so please feel free to make questions. But Robin, one question for you. Are all trees created equal? I mean, what I mean by that is, when a government plans their contributions to some big challenge, like the bond challenge, some big effort, are there any criteria that you would encourage them to follow when picking the species used for restoration?
Yes, thanks very much for that question. Well, first of all, I just wanted to refer to the bond challenge that does aim to bring 350 million hectares of forest into restoration by 2030. And countries began to make pledges beginning in 2011. The pledges included lots of different types of tree cover, and this has led to some confusion about what really is restoration, what is commercial forestry, what is reforestation, and how do all of things fit together. And quite honestly, the bond challenge was initially focused on initially focused on biodiversity conservation or on forest restoration. Its initial focus was really inclusively on all forms of reforestation, including industrial style monoculture forestry, couched in terms of forest and landscape restoration. So there have been some real issues that came out of that, plus a lot of other efforts to focus on tree planting. And in answer to your question, I really would say that, of course, not all trees are created equal. But it's also the case that not all situations and contexts are created equal. And that an important principle of ecosystem restoration is that we consider the local context and the needs of local communities in planning and implementing restoration. It's also another principle is that restoration should strive to achieve the highest level of ecosystem recovery possible for the sake of protecting biodiversity, ecosystem health and integrity, and human well-being. So ideally, restoration should have multiple co-benefits when it is being practiced. And that is really what separates restoration from just any type of reforestation that might be included in the bond challenge. And when selecting species for restoring forests, there are some really important considerations. I'm basing some of this on a document called the 10 Golden Rules of Reforestation. But the first thing is important to ask is it even important or needed to plant trees in order to assist the recovery of forests or to restore an area? There are many cases where natural regeneration of forest can do this job, and we can leave it to nature to take care of. And this can be the very best approach for conserving biodiversity. It is also much more cost effective and can allow for larger areas to undergo restoration. So it's important at the onset to assess the potential for natural recovery or assisted recovery if some assistance is needed. And that includes looking more broadly at the landscape context, looking at where remnant vegetation may be, what is the status of wildlife, and what are the local soil conditions. These are all part of what influences the forest recovery process. And then if tree planting is needed or warranted, consider whether that planting needs to include the entire area or whether it can just be strategically done in a few locations. And it's very important to focus on including mostly or exclusively native tree species in that tree planting process. Never should tree species be planted that are known to be invasive in the area. This can cause even further environmental degradation and displace native species. And controlling, often it's essential to control invasive species or to fence out grazing animals who are disrupting the recovery of the vegetation. So this is what I mean by assisted natural regeneration. The native species might, in many cases, won't grow as quickly as some of the exotic species, but they're more likely to survive and persist for many decades, and they also are associated more with native species, so they will attract native animals, and they will also enrich native organisms below ground. And in many cases, there are native tree species that have very important uses culturally, as well as for many different kinds of uses in the home, including medicinal uses and food and firewood, and they will support local livelihoods. So this makes it important that we plant the trees that local communities will want to have in their landscape, and that support local customs, culture, and livelihoods. And this could include some exotic species if these are not invasive and they will have value for local people. But it's really important to invite local communities to become engaged in this tree selection process and to kind of welcome these trees in their ecosystems and in their landscapes. They're going to be around for many decades, and people need to be maintaining them and taking care of them, and presumably getting benefits from them as soon as they can. And these trees can be planted or encouraged to regenerate on farms as well as on public land or protected areas. So trees must be valued and enhance the livelihoods as well as environmental conditions. And it's also important to plant a diversity of genotypes to ensure that the trees that are planted have the capacity to adapt to changing climate conditions or biological pressures. Climate change is already with us and all ecosystems are vulnerable. So we need to be thinking about species that have adequate genetic diversity to be able to respond. And we cannot always predict what trees are going to do best. So it's always best to plant a variety of different species. So that will ensure that at least some of them are going to do okay under climate stress conditions. It's essential that local people have rights to own or use the land on which trees are being planted and to harvest the trees that they plant or nurture. This has been a very difficult issue in some countries where the government owns any naturally regenerating tree, or even in some cases, trees that are planted, so that there's no incentive for local farmers or landowners to invest their time and effort in the restoration because they're not going to be able to benefit from those trees. So that's a very important political consideration. And it's important to select species or mixtures of species that are adapted to the local ecosystem. That's a main reason for using native species, because we know that they evolved in that ecosystem and they could deal with the kinds of stresses that that ecosystem has. But we also want to encourage the planting of species that protect and enrich the soil, that have good root systems, that will improve water infiltration, that will provide food products or fiber or fuel products that local people can use, and that will enhance water supplies and water quality. And in fact, in many regions of the world, we are ready with lists of species that can take care of this job. And I just want to make one final point, that it is really important that planting trees or forest restoration does not displace people for the purpose of forest restoration, especially if these people have traditional or indigenous rights to the land, or if they have had permission to occupy this area by previous governments. This action disrupts local communities, it creates hostilities, and it basically moves deforestation to another area. So it is not avoiding degradation. It leads to further deforestation and land degradation. So it's essential to find a way to work with local families and communities and incorporate them into the restoration project, even if they have come to occupy land that was reserved for conservation or restoration. These communities can become important allies and stewards of forest restoration if their livelihoods and systems of production are not overly compromised, and become part of the restoration process. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Robin. Next, I wanted to ask a question to Angela. Angela, do you think that the nature-based solution, the global standard of IUCN, could provide a backbone for environmental policies for an entire country? Like, for example, could a Ministry of the Environment of a country be structured around nature-based solutions as a guiding principle?
Thank you, Jean-Paul, for this interesting question. I would say that what the nature-based solutions framework, including the standard, offers is the possibility to go beyond the environmental sector. That has been so far one of our main constraints and difficulties to implement the global biodiversity agenda as well as the climate change agenda. Because usually most of these activities have been implemented by the ministries of environment in isolation, fighting or trying to be involved somehow with other ministries. But I think that the best way would be to have the nature-based solutions framework at the core of the national development plans, because it provides a very good opportunity to link I mentioned the most relevant SDGs that are directly connected with the status of ecosystems and the possibilities to bring ecosystem services for different sectors. No, for example, water provision or agriculture or forest activities that in many ministries are outside the environmental ministry, and also to connect with the energy sectors and other sectors that are really depending on the ecosystems. So I think that, and we have to be aware also that the nature-based solutions framework are not a panacea, let's say, to really be successful. They have to be connected with other important strategies, for example, circular economy or the low carbon development strategies that some countries have already developed. But if we see, for example, the plans that many countries already have for the year 2050, we see that, and with the latest results or findings of the IPCC reports that are really stressing that we need to act as soon as possible, and 2050 may be too late. And so perhaps the decarbonization should be in 2040 or something like that. So I think that this is something that it should be at the core of the government. So I think, and also the finance ministries have to be very much involved on this, because I don't see in the future the Minister of Environment fighting with other sectors trying to propose an agenda on nature-based solutions. Is something that is really concerning all sectors. And to do that, the government has also to work on developing the required enabling conditions to guarantee that nature-based solutions can be implemented. For example, we need to make sure that participatory processes are in place, that not all countries are already have already developed this kind of tools or ways to make sure that people can really participate and as well as the local communities. So that's very important. We need to make sure that there are adequate laws and regulations in topics like what Robin already mentioned about land tenure rights, but also governance, or the inclusion of social and environmental safeguards in all the process. And so this is a really strategic way to connect also with, for example, other development process with initiatives that are linked to the impact mitigation and ecological compensation initiatives that come from the other sectors like mining or like infrastructure that are crucial for development, but that at the end have to be well connected with nature. So my main message here would be to adopt the framework in national development plans, also subnational and local, as a way really to connect all the sectors. And we know that at the international level, all countries are committed with the NDCs, with some countries have already developed the low carbon development strategies, so are connected with that. But we see a very big opportunity now with the negotiations of the Global Biodiversity Framework to make sure that nature-based solutions are also connected with the new agenda, and that all the targets are well connected. So I see that this multi-level potential of governance, and it's very relevant for nature-based solutions. I will end with that. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Angela. Gabriela, you just spoke to us about IPES, the Sustainable Use Assessment that you were involved with. Now, what do you see as the major challenges for its implementation? Or more importantly, how do we confront these challenges?
Yes, thanks, Jean-Paul, for the good question. Well, I feel that there are various challenges at different levels, and I will be especially focusing in Latin America, but I guess that many of the things that I will mention apply to other regions as well. On the one hand, I feel that we need more political will and a different vision to rethink development models that take into account the environment dimension and not only short-term benefits. There is a challenge to confront interest groups and markets that are involved in extractivism projects, such as the expansion of the agricultural frontier, logging or large-scale mining that destroy territories and livelihoods and generate environmental liabilities. Many of these projects, that when they are not properly implemented, as it turns to happen in our region or in my country, force people out of their territories. And so migration results in the loss of local knowledge and the loss of connections with nature. There is a challenge as well to create incentives and infrastructure for communities to be able to choose to remain in rural areas and avoid out-migration. There is a challenge with regards to conflicts over land use, as we have multiple demands that are being placed on ecosystems and wild species in a context of growing human population. With regards to international instruments, the international instruments that support rights of indigenous people and local communities sometimes are not fully addressed in national policies. And there is and many institutions and policies that are governing wild species use do not take gender, which was one of the issues raised by the sustainable use assessment, into account, resulting in women being excluded from decision making. There is also a challenge with regards to sustainable use, the implementation of the sustainable use assessment with regards to the lobby by anti-use NGOs groups that seem to overlook livelihood needs of local populations. With regards to authorities and policymakers, at least in our region, there is a lack of training of high-level authorities, just as ministers or heads of divisions on environmental issues and multidisciplinary approaches. Usually the environmental departments are understaffed, and there is a lack of funding for the implementation, follow-up, and regulation of sustainable use projects. As Angela was mentioning, we need more articulation between the different ministries and departments and to make biodiversity a cross-cutting issue. And last but not least, in the case of the IPE sustainable assessment, one of the things that is really of my concern is dissemination. So how do we get the information of this very nice report into the hands of people that can use it at the state, municipal, or community levels? How do we get the results of this report to indigenous communities so that it can be a tool for them? How do we get the report to the people that sustain their livelihoods out of nature? And how to do it? Well, one basic thing is that we need translation. We need the translation of the SPM into different UN languages, but also into indigenous languages. And we also need to be creative and thoughtful in order to create infographics summarizing the key results, in order to communicate the results more in languages that are maybe less technical and more easily understandable by the general public. And we need to implement this by doing workshops from the regional to the local level with communities. I think that's, yeah.
Great, thank you so much, Gabriela. Sonia, so, you know, I get the feeling personally that, you know, local governments such as cities, municipalities, states tend to be much more flexible and adaptable, creative, with respect to their approaches to environmental policies and actions. I certainly felt that way 10 years ago at the Rio+20 summit. But then global policies are still driven by national governments, and they systematically fail to meet the goals they set for themselves. So is it time to change our approach, maybe give up on national governments and invest our efforts at the subnational level?
Excellent question, Jumpo. Well, I feel your and many people's, I guess, frustrations around national governments, lack of pace, lack of commitment, compliance with what they agree to. However, I think I'm more positive, and I don't think the solution lies in turning our backs completely to national governments or focusing completely on something else and other actors. On the contrary, I think that we have to bring, so let's bring other actors on board, and subnational governments and cities and local authorities and are part of this movement, let's say, and they are an excellent example to jointly then drive that action, conservation action at all levels of society. So if you think about cities and municipalities, they can spearhead local efforts, show example of things that actually work at that level, to increase conservation work action on the ground. They can even showcase success stories, of which there are many cases nowadays. Gain support from the regular citizen, young people, women, academics, the private sector, etc. And that, movement creates pressure on national governments to follow suit, to get activated. They're more creative in terms of action they lead themselves. On the subnational governments, I want to point out and note that last year in Marseille, in the World Conservation Congress of IUCN, the membership of IUCN adopted a new membership category that includes subnational governments and authorities. So they are now part of IUCN as members. And I think this is important. It's important to know because this movement was prompted precisely by the sentiment, I think, that subnational governments have much to offer in terms of delivering IUCN's vision, mission, and work, generally speaking, in nature conservation. And they bring to the Union local action, again, on the ground, more practical experiences at the local level. They touch on people's lives much more easily, let's say, than national governments that tend to be more distant from the regular citizens of the world. So their decisions impact us all more directly. If we could point out at examples of work already carried out with cities and subnational governments, I will bring the example of work that has been carried out in IUCN in conjunction with Khuridabat, the city of Khuridabat, that I bet many of you don't know where that is. I had to check where that was because the name seems like it's in India, but it's not. It's in Costa Rica. Paris, Lagos, Mexico City, Singapore, and many other cities. And we have developed this IUCN Urban Nature Index. So this is a compilation, let's say, a suite of indicators for measuring the ecological performance of cities across urban, bioregional, global spheres of impact. And this is nowadays being digitized, so it's put in a digital format. And I think it demonstrates that at that level also, at the cities and municipalities level, one can also, again, be creative and measure progress against conservation action with very, practical tools like this Urban Nature Index. And if you want to learn more about success stories in cities in conservation, I invite you to check the Panorama Cities website. I can put afterwards the link in the chat, which actually documents examples of inspiring replicable solutions across a range of conservation and sustainable development topics in a cross-sectoral way and inspires further action. I think that that's important to emphasize here. So to go back to your initial question, I wouldn't give up on national governments, but yes, I will bring to the forefront other actors that can contribute to spearhead political decision making in the right direction, but also action on the ground.
Great. Thank you so much, Sonia. For this last round of questions, before we take a couple of questions from the audience, just since you're warmed up speaking, Sonia, the question goes to you. We can start. Just give us in a brief 4 minutes or so, a final thought about, the challenges that we face from your perspective in terms of biodiversity loss and what we can do about it. You might have mentioned some of these, but if you could just succinctly just focus on where do we go from here, that would be great. So Sonia first, and then Robin, Angela, and Gabriela. So Sonia.
Yeah, well, okay, thank you. And at the risk of repeating some of the things that we have already mentioned, and this is something that Gabriela did mention before, if you ask me, one of the biggest challenges we face in terms of, or in the international policy, at the international policy level for tackling biodiversity loss is the lack of political will. So we have the science, we have the facts, we have the knowledge, we have the technology that supports, that can support that drive or that transformative change that is needed. And yet somehow we see that at the policy level, we don't seem to make, steady progress. That again, we lack pace, we lack commitment, and even vision to drive, action forward. So here, I mean, that's I think it's again a fact, and one can say that theoretically political will then exists when you have sufficient amount of decision makers, policy decision makers, that have a common understanding of the problem that is being tackled or that we're facing. It can be also a common understanding of an agenda. And are committed actually to supporting a common effective policy solution, and that we are not seeing that yet. Another challenge that I see, and that is on all of us, it's not only governments and decision makers or negotiators, it's on all of us, is inertia. I think that there's too much passivity, inactivity, inaction, tendency to do nothing or to remain unchanged just because of the perception that this is not with me, or I am an individual that cannot do much to solve such a big problem. And that, I think, creates a snowball effect that doesn't help at all. And for both challenges, I think the most effective way to tackle them or to start doing something about them is to keep on emphasizing on two things. And one is this sense of oneness or togetherness. We're all in the same boat, and basically if that boat sinks, we're all gonna drown with it. So we better move and do something about it. And there is also the sense of, yes, we can, a la Obama, more or less, on the other side. So we have to really focus on the solutions, on what we have available to help us, advance in the right direction, rather than only focusing on the gloom and doom picture of the headlines that I showed in my first slide, which tend to create also that passivity or paralysis and a lack of inaction. So let's focus on we're together on this, and the yes, we can, and move forward.
Thank you, Sonia. Robin.
Thank you. Well, I just want to highlight the fact that avoiding habitat loss and ecosystem degradation, which leads to species loss, are one of the important pillars of ecosystem restoration. And if we want to prevent or halt the loss of ecosystems, we cannot restore them. That's a really important concept. This means that we need to understand the factors that are driving ecosystem loss and degradation, and be prepared to undertake those systemic changes within our political and economic system to make course corrections. And that's where this really becomes a societal issue. Yes, we can. I totally agree. And we have to get people on board with understanding that these kinds of holistic approaches are essential for our coexistence. Restoring forest ecosystems inevitably involves trade-offs, and this applies to all ecosystem types. And that's important to recognize, to identify those trade-offs, and to manage them in appropriate ways so that we don't leave out important elements and leave out important interests. One example is the importance of maximizing economic returns for land managers and farmers from some kind of commercial-based production systems that will inevitably reduce some of the benefits for biodiversity and long-term carbon storage in the ecosystem. So there are very clear trade-offs, and we need to find ways to balance them, to balance different practices and objectives at the landscape scale is really where we can accommodate all of those different needs. and then we can provide the greatest overall benefits for nature and for people. So here we might need to expand our vision from a particular ecosystem to the broader landscape in order to reach that balance, to really maximize the protection of species that are vulnerable to extinction through restoring ecosystems really requires a spatial approach. And as the most vulnerable species are those that have the most restricted, endemic species that have very restricted geographic ranges. So we need to have data that tells us where these vulnerable species are. And in fact, those data generally exist for many parts of the world. And then we can use that information to map where restoring the forests or other ecosystems would be likely to protect those vulnerable species, would be adding to the habitat available for them. And in fact, this approach has already been done in the Atlantic forests of Brazil, where there's an estimated 27 to 32% of endemic species to the biome, and they are on a path to extinction unless restoration happens in those areas where those species are remaining. And so using a variety of data that were collected for plants, amphibians, and birds, our group modeled scenarios that would maximize different restoration objectives. And one of those objectives was biodiversity conservation, increasing habitat where those vulnerable species exist. And the study found that close to 30% of those species committed to extinction could be saved through strategically planning restoration over about 5 million hectares of forest, which is the restoration goal for the region. So you wouldn't accomplish that conservation goal by just randomly restoring forests. They have to be strategically located in the areas where these species are likely to be able to use those habitats. And the cost of that restoration was about $35 billion. So there's a huge price tag for doing targeted restoration, but it is the cost and benefit ratio is substantially higher than if you do randomly located restoration. And we can also use modeling scenarios. We also did in the study, we modeled scenarios that maximized both simultaneously biodiversity conservation and carbon storage while minimizing the cost. So we were able to identify areas where those three objectives could be achieved simply by targeting restoration in the right areas. As it happens for a lot of restoration scenarios, biodiversity conservation is really not the highest priority. In many cases, it's for water or for preventing erosion, or in some cases for carbon storage. And biodiversity, may be a co-benefit, but it isn't always the targeted action. And in many situations, this makes sense. So we really don't want to emphasize biodiversity conservation in every part of the globe if it's because of the huge variability. And some areas simply have a low potential to protect vulnerable species. So those areas should be restored for other objectives and not so much for biodiversity. So part of the challenge is really understanding how we can maximize different opportunities that are available to us so that we make the most of the situation we have, and that we have the capacity to assess and use the necessary information to do this balancing act, to appropriately balance different restoration objectives and capacities so that we have the best overall outcome. So I think a major challenge from the perspective of biodiversity conservation is to promote the implementation of the most appropriate restoration practices in places where there are the best possible outcomes for biodiversity, where those outcomes are most likely. So it's really using a lot of the science to identify where are those locations, what are those species or species groups that are most likely going to benefit, and where are the greatest opportunities for achieving this goal. We have examined many of those priority areas on a global basis now, and that can really serve as important guidance for where we can prioritize restoration with the goal of biodiversity conservation. But at the end of the day, we know that conservation science and modeling isn't going to provide all the answers, and that social and political and economic considerations play a very important role in this process. So we need to really align a lot of the scientific recommendations in a way that can be used to guide policy and spatial planning, and ultimately to guide the decisions that are being made about where and how to allocate funding and allocate effort to restore, with local and regional and national authorities who need to be accountable for their decisions and actions. So the scientists really need to work with these groups and provide information and help to guide their decisions, which ultimately will be made on probably not primarily on biodiversity issues, but on a whole range of other issues. But we mustn't leave the biodiversity aside, and we need to highlight where restoration can do its best for protecting species.
Excellent, thank you. Angela.
Well, thank you. I think that some of the challenges are, coming from the climate change science, and after the IPCC latest report was released, I think we learned a lot of things, and especially that climate change is not happening in a similar way across the planet. So that means that there are certain areas where the impacts of climate change are more severe than others. And in fact, as I mentioned shortly in my presentation, there are already about 30% of the ecosystems that are losing resilience. And so that is very serious because, well, according to the publication, this is happening in some areas of the world, especially the Arctic, boreal areas, the tundra, but we know that there are close analogies with the altitude in the tropics, for example, and problems that we do not understand very well. But so if the ecosystems are losing their resilience, for example, in high mountains, there is no way up for species. So there is no way to go. So in those cases, I think we should prioritize some actions, because this will affect the provision of water, for example. This will affect migration, internal migration, or migration in general to other countries, and that is something that is quite serious. So I think that the clear understanding of the connection between the impacts of climate change and the status of the ecosystems is extremely important. And even if we have good science, our science so far has been also fragmented. And so we need to really promote transdisciplinary science in understanding the way socio-ecological systems behave and respond to this kind of impacts. So I think this is a big challenge, because we are mainly used to work in silos, and our disciplines are quite narrow. Soil science from vegetation science, from different natural or social sciences. Also, I think a big challenge is to increase the understanding of the value of ecosystem services. So because, for example, in the implementation of nature-based solutions, especially the criteria that is focused on economic analysis, I think we all know that ecosystem services are undervalued. And if that continues, so this will be a big challenge for really implementing and making and demonstrating the role of nature in providing services to people and to communities. Robin already mentioned the issue of synergies and trade-offs. She mentioned more trade-offs, but I think synergies is also very, very relevant. And it's not just between carbon sequestration and biodiversity conservation. There are many other issues that are happening, but these days, the big discussion is there. It's either if you see some low carbon strategies are focused on biofuels and activities that may be useful for the energy sector, but may harm biodiversity in some ecosystems if that's not done considering all the criteria that, for example, in the NBS standard is concentrated, or in criteria 3 that is focused on delivery on biodiversity net gains, not just at ecosystem level, but at the species level. So should be considering all the levels of biological organization. And yeah, and I would say that this is also affecting the possibilities or the abilities of the ecosystems to regenerate. So if we are not considering this kind of impacts, we may be investing money in restoration or in other activities in areas that are not, that cannot really regenerate due to climate change. So I think this is why I think it's extremely important to have frameworks like the NBS framework in the National Development Agenda, connecting everything, because it's really a good way to sit everyone on the table and analyze all together the pros and cons of implementing a different activity in the territory. So yeah, that's it for now.
Thank you. The final word from Gabriela.
Yeah, thank you. Well, in terms of challenges with regards to sustainable use of biodiversity, well, as Angela mentioned, climate change, the increasing demand of goods and services, the decoupling the consumption of wild species from their places of origin, the lack of awareness of the environmental cost of our daily actions. And here with my students, we work not only on the social environmental costs of lithium mining, but also to become aware of the environmental costs of our own decisions every day at another level. What are the environmental costs of attending meetings in terms of flights? What are the environmental costs of what we decide to eat? What are the environmental costs of the products, of our transport, etc.? Because we are all a part of the problem, and as it was mentioned before, in the same way, we are all a part of the solution, and we all need to feel that we are a part of the solution, that the solution doesn't rely above, but it is also at our level. Other challenges are the current patterns of production and consumption, especially in northern countries, and poverty and inequality that are underlying drivers of unsustainable use. So, well, there are many things that we can do to tackle these at different levels. It would be good if we could consider humanity again to be a part of nature. I also ask my students, are humans within nature? Are we apart from nature? And basically, it is so important to start thinking again, well, as in academia we are doing, on socio-ecological systems and of humans as a part of nature, in order to develop a more respectful and sustainable relationship with nature. We need sustainable use to be a part of international treaties and negotiations. And Sonia, you are here. I know that for Latin American countries, the sustainable use assessment is extremely important and will be very key in the CBD negotiations, because for Latin America, sustainable use and to increase and develop sustainable use is a part of local livelihoods. And at a local level, we need concerted interventions to implement and scale up policy actions that have shown and support successful stories on wildlife use. We were discussing the importance of political will, and political will is also influenced by voters. And so we need the environmental agenda to be part of the political agenda, so that voters also know what they are voting for. Because at least in our countries, we have no clue about the environmental agenda of the different governments that we are voting. An environmental agenda is crucial for all of us. And I think that I will leave it here.
Great, thank you so much. We have about 15 minutes left, and there are a couple of questions from the audience that I will, Naomi has placed for me on a document here. So apologies for my mispronunciation of your names. Dejen asked, biodiversity conservation as standalone or as a system? So ecosystem management and restoration, how do we go about it? Is it a standalone or a system? How do you approach it? Maybe Robin could take that.
That's an important question. It really is a system, and it really needs to become mainstreamed into all of the policies that are taking place and actions. And one example that I would provide is within the country of Costa Rica, the country is divided up into conservation areas. Every part of the country is a part of a conservation area simply by its location. And by doing that, they have begun to decentralize a lot of the decision-making about activities and combined conservation and restoration, sustainable management, all within the same region. So they're taking a regional approach to solving a lot of the problems, and to it also links strongly with economy and production systems within those regions. So this is a way to get closer to policies that really are aligning and holistically planning all of these activities.
Great.
It's hard to do.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. I have a question from Julia Jardine. What is the best way to communicate to public health networks that environmental health is pressing and needs to be prioritized in the public health spaces? It seems still widely neglected at many public health organizations. I don't know who would like to take that.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't touch specifically in any of your themes, but I think it's kind of a general. I see Angela.
Yes, I would like to mention something in that, because this is extremely important. When I said that for example, the nature-based solutions should be at the core of national development plans. I didn't mention explicitly the topic of human health, but these days, and after the COVID-19 experience that we had, we documented a lot of connections between ecosystem health and different outbreaks of diseases. And there are examples where we see that ecosystem degradation is directly related to outbreaks, for example, of malaria, dengue, and other tropical diseases. So we need to invest more on that. And we need to make sure that the prevention phase of in many public health initiatives consider the connection with the status of ecosystems. I think there are more and more examples. We are currently working in our commission of Iucn, documenting and making some analysis of the relationship between the status of the ecosystems and climate change and outbreaks of different diseases. So I think this is extremely important, and is also connected with the global initiative of One Health approach that is also endorsed by many countries, and it will be also a very important topic for the next negotiations of the CBD, and and they were also covered by in Marseille, and there is one specific resolution dealing with that. So I think it's very important, and we need to really improve the information, but also involve the health sector in this discussion.
Yeah, no, yeah, go ahead, Gabriela.
Yeah, if I may add, I was thinking, Jean-Paul, that maybe you could share here the situation analysis produced by Iucn, which might be of use, because it shows the connection between different environmental and social drivers on, well, in this particular case was the coronavirus pandemic. I think that could be a good background.
Yeah, I'll put it on the chat now. I just wanted to say that, in fact, like Angela just mentioned, Iucn supports a One Health view of the world, and that includes that, you know, all species, domestic, wild, or urban, or whatever, humans are connected or our well-being is related to each other. So there is certainly a growing movement in the veterinary sciences and the human medical sciences and other disciplines as well to work. And we are participating very actively in several of these platforms at the international level. So yes, I'll share the situation analysis link in a second. There are a couple of more questions. Another one from Julia. Planting trees with stewardship practice was mentioned as not always the ideal practice. Could you elaborate a little more on this and what local stewards should do instead? So much of local stewardship in, I think, is New York State, is based around removing invasives and possibly salvageable areas and planting trees and preserves as one of the main expenses incurred. I think that's Robin's as well.
Yes, I didn't mean to imply that planting trees is never a good idea, but it has. My point was, you know, the right tree, the right place, and the right context, and planting in the right way. I do think that the emphasis on removing invasives is really important. In some situations where there is native vegetation, but it's being held back by being choked by invasive species, focusing on removing those invasives basically releases the potential for natural regeneration. So not that that is easy, but that is often the main thing that is needed, because even if you were to plant trees in those ecosystems, they would be overrun as well. So that's where understanding the sources of degradation at the beginning is really essential for determining what are the best types of approaches for implementing. And a mixed approach is often the most useful, where you can plant trees in areas where they're not regrowing or where the soils are not amenable. And then in other parts of the area where trees are growing, just do things to help to protect them, or fence out animals that may be chewing up seedlings and things like that. So it really requires kind of assessment case by case of what are the main sources of degradation, and then taking actions.
Great, Jess. Christoph Arvanitidis follows up with another question. How about the knowledge of local populations? What kind of instruments do we have currently to engage them in planning?
Well, in terms of restoration, there are one of the main principles of ecosystem restoration is to use all sources of knowledge, and that includes local, traditional, and indigenous knowledge. So that is essential. And I think some of the best ways of doing that are by fully involving local communities at the very, very beginning, when restoration is first being considered. And in fact, many local communities already are initiating restoration practices on their own. It's already part of their culture and their tradition. So in many cases, we just need to encourage and allow these communities to take these actions and embrace it and count it and include it. So I think this is really the essential part, is making clear that this knowledge must be incorporated in as many ways as possible for restoring ecosystems at all levels.
Fabulous, thank you. I don't see any more questions in the chat. We have a few minutes left. Is there any final, we have 5 minutes left, any final thought that you would like to share with the audience? So there's a comment quickly on the chat. Let me see what it says. Witness to what Robin is saying. I have observed 40 years of planting trees during the day, and farmers were uprooting them during the night. Wrong trees, wrong place. Thank you. Very good. Well, any final thought that you would like to share with the audience? Going away message? Any optimism left, or more? There was some optimism in your presentations, absolutely. But any more optimism? Sonia, I see you lifting your hand.
Yeah, I'm an optimist at heart. So yes, definitely. And I think one of the things that we could pull out from this discussion today is that for science to better inform policy making or decision making, we need to simplify the message and convey science in a way that it's approachable to everyone and understandable to everyone. And that goes for the policy makers, decision makers, negotiators, government. If we come out with the pure raw facts from science and we dump that on their desk, they won't process that information. It needs to be conveyed in a way that it's understandable for different audiences, and for that I think that we could think of aligning also or joining efforts with the young generations. They are in the CVD, for instance. They are very actively taking part in the negotiations, going through commenting on everything, providing views and recommendations on the process in a way that precisely narrows that down to a very practical and very palpable way to approach this very complex issue. Sometimes biodiversity in and of itself is not an easy concept to understand. So I think that we have more work to do in that respect, in conveying the science message in a way that it's more simple. But that there's definitely hope of doing that. There are many creative minds out there, and we can do that. So there you go.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Robin.
I would just add that we really must have the private sector on board in the future, and they are getting on board. And we need to really raise capacity all across the board, not just with the private sector, but to really channel the concern that climate change is generating now to reach a tipping point that's going to bring converts from all different realms of the world. And they're finally coming to grips with the fact that something has to be done, and it's big, and it's going to affect everybody's bottom line. But our bottom line is going to be much worse if we do nothing. And the private sector is definitely going to need to hear that argument and become a major player.
Great. Well, we 1 minute, Gabriela.
No,
Really
sorry. No. On top of the private sector, that I agree, I think that we have to get indigenous and local communities on board, and not merely as a token person to make as if they were participating. We really should encourage full participation, as we need to encourage women participation. And I'm very glad, Jean-Paul, of how you structure this panel with so many women from different places, which is still extremely important. And on the optimistic side, I was, given that we are within the UN Assembly here, I was thinking of the Sustainable Development Goals and how in the last not that many years, the environment got a bigger place in the international discussions and agendas. So it is possible, as we are seeing with the SDGs. So that's it.
Okay, final word, Angela, 30 seconds.
Just to invite you to be members of the user community of nature-based solutions and the nature-based solutions standard, because it's a good way to share your experiences, and we are all learning how to address these challenges.
Brilliant. And just to conclude, I would like to thank you all for participating in this wonderful panel, and the audience for sticking through the conversation. Please share the recording widely. And for the record, we made this panel looking for the best people that by coincidence were women as well, but it was a great outcome as well. So thank you all for being here. It's been a pleasure for me and very informative and useful, and I look forward to further exchanges. Thanks so much on behalf of Iucn, the Species Survival Commission, and the organizers of the Scientific Summit of UGA. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.